This is Parker on Hitchcock.
Here we have a quiet little motel, tucked away off the main highway, and as you see, perfectly harmless looking.
There's not a filmmaker working today who's not been influenced by Hitchcock, even if they don't admit it, quite frankly.
This motel also has, as an adjunct, an old house, which is, if I may say so, a little more sinister looking.
Unlike the rest of us, this is a person who made 53 films. I mean, that's over a very, very long period of time. I mean, it's a colossal body of work. And they're not all great movies, it has to be said. But within it, there's more great movies than probably any other director ever made.
And in this house, the most dire, horrible events took place. Let's go inside.
I can remember Psycho because I was of an age when I started to get interested in film. I can remember in my class, it was sort of the cool and the uncool. It was like the kids who had managed to get into Psycho and those who hadn't been able to get to see Psycho. So the first time I suddenly realised that actually films just didn't, I thought that the projectionist made them. And suddenly you realise there's this thing called a film director, and the film director is at work with regards to what they want you to think, the sheer manipulation of it.
You see, even in daylight, this place still looks a bit sinister. And I was at the top of these stairs. Well, the murderer, you see, crept in here very slowly. Of course, the shower was on, there was no sound. And
the thing about Hitchcock was that he worked through several decades, but he was always at the forefront of movies in every decade. My name is Barry Norman. He was born in 1899, which was only 3 or 4 years after the Lumiere brothers had first shown movies in Paris, and he died in 1980. So his life kind of spanned most of the 20th century. His passion was for film, was for telling stories, and for telling stories as visually as he possibly could.
I remember I was in New Orleans shooting Angel Heart, and I was shooting Mickey Rourke's feet going up the stairs, and suddenly, and I thought to myself, I don't know which Hitchcock film this is from, whether it's from Psycho or Strangers on a Train, but actually the images stick in your head and you find yourself imitating them.
I'm Neil Sinyard, Head of Film Studies at Hull University, and I've been teaching courses on Hitchcock for 20 years, and they're always well subscribed, they're always popular, students get a lot out of them. There are more books on him, I think, than on any other filmmaker. There are people working away on PhDs. He seems to be generating more and more interest. And yet this was not always the case. I always remember hearing an interview on Late Night Lineup in about 1968, I think, where Hitchcock was very ironical about how he's been treated by critics.
Talking about anti-heroes, critics are sometimes very anti-Hitchcock. Can you give me your thoughts on critics?
I think they're very nice. I think they're very human. They're subject to all kinds of human foibles, is that the word? And I think they mean very well. I'm not going to stress the word mean. I said they mean very well. And they have their job to do. And I have my job to do.
This is a director who, for most of his life, was really clobbered by the critics, and so he was very sensitive. And so he used to say, well, it's actually the audience that matters. But probably deep down, he was probably quite hurt by it.
If one gets a bad notice, well, you always remember the old adage, that was yesterday's newspaper.
I think all of us who put our head on the block and often have it chopped off by critics, you have to be conscious of what they're saying.
Alan's problem is that in America he's regarded as a serious European film director. In this country he's regarded, sometimes sneeringly, as, mere commercial Hollywood director. Well, there's nothing wrong with being a commercial Hollywood director. That, after all, is what Hitchcock was. And I suppose if Hitchcock came in for criticism, that was possibly, again, this kind of snobbish thing that, it's merely Hollywood commercial.
Hitchcock played games with critics in some ways by trying to talk down his films. He had this famous comment where he said films aren't a slice of life, they're a slice of cake. And I think he sort of threw critics off the scent a little bit in that. And I think the other thing about him is that he was one of these artists who managed to combine being profound with being popular. Like Dickens was in the same way. Someone who did appreciate this combination was the writer-director Peter Bogdanovich. Bogdanovich was very important in enhancing Hitchcock's reputation because he put on a retrospective of Hitchcock's complete work in the early 1960s.
He liked to do things realistically that were essentially unrealistic. Like North by Northwest, he said, I was very amused to read a critic that said the picture was unconsciously funny. Well, my dear, it's a complete fantasy. There's no such direction on the compass as North by Northwest. It doesn't exist.
Mr. Hitchcock, you seem to have a very nice sense of humour, which you obviously had before you established yourself as directing thrillers. How come you've never had any comedies?
But every film I make is a comedy.
Critics have very little sense of humour, actually. And I think another reason why he wasn't taken seriously is because he was always appearing in his films. No one ever knew what Stanley Kubrick looked like. Everybody knew what Alfred Hitchcock looked like, which became a sort of joke, and then it became a superstition, and then it became something that people looked for, and it, in a way, cheapened somewhat the quality of the work.
I remember seeing Hitchcock being interviewed on stage at the National Film Theatre in 1970, and he was always a very amusing interviewee.
Mr. Hitchcock, could you tell us when you first had the idea of appearing in all your films? I think it started with The Lodger, and could you tell us why? Because I don't know of any other filmmaker that does it.
No, in those early days we ran out of actors. That's really true.
I think there's no question that his popularity, his success, made him critically unfashionable. I always felt a certain edge of resentment and maybe a bit of bitterness at the Academy and at critics in general.
Hitchcock's films did win Oscars, but he himself never won the Best Directing Oscar, although he was nominated 5 times. And I think there was a sense of injustice there. He felt he did deserve recognition from his peers, and he never got it. And I think he felt there were other aspects of his films as well that deserved more recognition than they actually received.
Well, we're on dangerous ground here. I won't talk about myself, but I will voice one little complaint. One of the most, I think, astounding technical achievements by technicians was in the picture called The Birds. And nobody will ever know the fact that we use the optical printing facilities of every studio in Hollywood and the supervision of one of the most brilliant men, a man called Ab Iwerks, who is Disney's man, and yet the Academy gave the award to some little dissolve effect in Cleopatra.
There's an amazing scene in The Birds about halfway through where the heroine, played by Tippi Hedren, goes to the school, has to wait outside in the playground. And while she's waiting, behind her we see a bird just landing on the climbing frame. First 1 bird, then 2, then 3, then 4. And at that particular moment, Hitchcock then cuts to the heroine so that we can't see what is happening behind her. And then suddenly she looks up to the sky and there's a bird flying across the heavens. And it's coming down, she follows its flight, and it lands on the climbing frame, and the climbing frame is absolutely packed with birds, and they're just waiting there.
The Birds was an inordinately complicated film technically to do. It's amazing that he would have the patience to do it because it was extraordinarily difficult. I mean, we look at Jurassic Park or monster movies where the monster's there and you think, well, what's the big deal with some birds? But that was the trick of that movie, was to make birds ominous, these everyday animals that you don't think anything about, make them terrifying and not make it look like a cartoon. It was a gruelingly difficult movie to make.
If you think of him in contemporary terms, if he was still shooting now, he would have the ability to work with video assisted, see what he was doing. He would have smaller cameras, he would have faster film, and also he would have the great new advent of digital effects. And I think that what he was trying to do was obviously, pioneering really, if you look at The Birds.
The technique of the birds, the phony birds, would have perhaps been less obvious to me if they'd have been in black and white. I wondered why you opted for colour.
Well, I opted for colour because the birds were black and white.
Yes.
So that the faces of the people involved would be separated from the birds. We actually used real birds. There were no mechanical birds used at all.
Well, there were one or two wooden ones or stationary ones, weren't there?
We hoped that it deceived the eye.
When he was talking about that, when he would talk about how he did a shot or why he did a shot a certain way, his eyes sparkled, he's lit up like a bulb, he was very excited, and he enjoyed it, I could tell. The thing he enjoyed the most is telling you how he did it and why he did it.
In North by Northwest, Cary Grant plays this character called Roger Thornhill, and he's been sent for an assignment to meet this person whom we know doesn't exist. And he's just dropped in the middle of nowhere at this prairie stop. He has been set up and we're expecting something to come at him from somewhere, but we don't know where, and we can't see where the danger can be coming from. And he gets into a conversation with this guy who's just about to get on a bus, and suddenly this guy says to him, "That's funny, that plane's dusting crops where there ain't no crops." And then he gets on the bus and goes before Cary Grant can ask him what he means. And that statement just hangs ominously in the air for a moment, and then suddenly we realise what's about to happen.
I can look at North by Northwest now and I go, oh yes, that's back projection, when Cary Grant suddenly has his head chopped off by the crop dusting aeroplane. But actually, at the time when I saw the film, I had no idea that that was done on a soundstage. I thought the whole thing was done out in the open. So I think we can be very sort of smarty pants about it now, because the whole special effects world is so sophisticated and has moved on in leaps and bounds. But with regards to audiences at the time, there's no way that they could see the trickery. I think that they just always thought it was for real. The ability to be able to think out your film beforehand, although apparently he did a lot more improvisation than he ever admitted to be able to pre-think a film, to be able to cut in your head, I think is something I always admire and always aspire to do. But I think the fact that to him you shouldn't bore the audience for 1 second, and therefore every single frame had to matter.
I work very closely with the writer and begin to construct the film on paper. When we roughly sketch in the whole shape of the film, you end up with, say, 100 pages or maybe even more of narrative, which is very bad reading for a litterateur. It's as though you were looking at the film on the screen and the sound was turned off.
I think he did have elaborate storyboards, as far as I know, not for every single frame of every single film. I think there are certain sequences that you would have to storyboard, and there are others which would not need it. He could draw, and the ability to draw and scribble on set probably was very useful for him. But I think to be able to imagine the scene before you've shot it is obviously the great genius.
The reason for it is this. It is to urge one, to drive one, to make one work purely in the visual, not rely upon words at all. Because I'm still a purist, and I do believe that film, being the newest art of the 20th century, is a series of images projected on a screen, and this succession of images create ideas, which in their turn create emotion.
The beauty, of course, of a Hitchcock film is that it's very spare with regards to the words, and so much of the story is told visually, which makes it much more international medium. That obviously comes from the fact that he is unique in that he had such an enormous career in talking pictures and an enormous career in silent pictures.
There are signs in quite a lot of Alan Parker's films of Hitchcock's influence, but I think the one that struck me most vividly was the opening sequence in Mississippi Burning, when the 3 civil rights workers get into their car and drive away, and suddenly behind them falls in car after car full of a red-necked lynch mob. And the sense of dread, something awful going to happen, that Alan builds up there is incredibly Hitchcockian. I think Hitch himself would have been very proud to have directed that scene. It's one of the great moments in the cinema.
I think the key thing that I learned from Hitchcock and have used on every picture is what he called the subjective use of the camera, or what he always referred to as pure cinema, which Rear Window was probably the most obvious example of. which was, as he would say, a shot of Jimmy Stewart looking at something, a shot of what he sees, and then back to for his reaction. To him, that's pure cinema, putting the audience in the place of the leading character. And yet there are several key moments where it's very clear that you're seeing something Jimmy Stewart isn't seeing. And that's just pure, brilliant visual storytelling.
It sounds kind of corny and trite, and it's the obvious scene that everybody, is aware of with regards to the shower scene in Psycho. It's brilliantly shot. It's only 45 seconds or something of screen time, but it's made up of 70-odd shots or something. And yet the most powerful shot actually is the one where he stands still, where you suddenly see her and then there's the plastic curtain and you see this dark shadow suddenly come towards you. It's the most scariest moment, and you see nothing at all, really. Even the conclusion of it, you see the blood going down the plug hole, and that circular shape suddenly dissolves into the pupil of her eye, and then you suddenly pull out and pull out and pull out, which seems to be almost like a still photograph and not actually real. It's just beautifully done, and I think that if anyone wants to learn about how to cut film to be effective, that's a scene to watch. And then just the beauty of the pacing of it and extraordinary Bernard Herrmann music, which is pretty incredible and very, very original for its time, and now much copied since, obviously.
Psycho is interesting because I always remember the advertising about the film and all this publicity thing to do with that no one would be allowed to enter the cinema after the film has started, which in the days of continuous performances was something that was unheard of. And the other thing that Hitchcock did was that he insisted that critics saw the film with the general public. Critics hate that. They think that production companies are trying to influence their opinion, that if the public are enjoying these films, then they should as well. Peter Bogdanovich describes this very well.
Psycho is the moment in movies when, for the first time, movies weren't safe. I was at the first screening of Psycho. In New York, I was on the critics list. There was a screening at 10 for the critics, who sat upstairs in a balcony that sat about 500, and there was 1,000 regular paying customers downstairs in the orchestra. And there was no synopsis handed out. There was just a basic cast list, and there'd been no advance about it. Hitchcock's voice was playing on a loudspeaker outside saying nobody would be admitted after the picture started, and please not to reveal the ending. I remember coming out of the screening and feeling like I'd been raped or something, or mugged. It was absolutely terrifying. Nobody recovered from that shower scene. I mean, you couldn't hear the soundtrack. The audience was screaming through the entire 45 seconds, or whatever it is. They were just literally screaming. I never heard those violins.
There was a film where I transferred the fear seen on the screen, and as the film went on, I transferred it from the screen to the mind of the audience. In fact, the film got less violent as it went on.
I looked around, the critics were staring, stricken at the screen. I think a couple of them were screaming. It was absolutely terrifying. Nobody expected that. I mean, this is Janet Leigh. She's the star. She's getting killed.
A friend of mine who was present at the press screening of Psycho told me that the doyen of English film critics of that time, C.A. Lejeune of The Observer, who was also a personal friend of Hitchcock's, actually walked out of the film after the shower murder in disgust. Indeed, she retired from film reviewing shortly after that.
In 1961, I met him at his office at Paramount. He was very nice to me, and even when I said I wasn't that keen on Psycho, it wasn't one of my favorites of his, which was his most recent film, he said, well, that's because you didn't see it with the same humorous background that I approached it, I saw it as a humorous film. I said, humorous? He said, yeah. Peggy, and he calls Peggy, show Peter the trailer of Psycho, will you? And so the next thing I knew, we were going to a screening room, Hitchcock, Peggy, and me, and he showed me the trailer of Psycho.
She came out of the door there and met the victim at the top. Of course, in a flash, there was the knife, and in no time, the victim tumbled and fell with a horrible crash. I think the back broke immediately and hit the floor.
And it was Hitch walking around that motel in the house, very jauntily talking about, well, all this terrible thing happens here. Oh my God, wait till you see it. You know? And it was very humorous with that TV theme that he had playing all through it. As you know, by then he'd been a huge television star for about 6 years. So he showed me the trailer, and he turned to me and said, "You see what I mean?" So of course I said yes. Since I knew that Hitchcock never sees his films with an audience, I asked him if he didn't miss hearing them scream. And he said, "No, I can hear them when I'm making the picture," which I thought was marvelous.
He had made himself into this huge celebrity, and that came from Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which was a television thing that he did. On the other hand, that was incredibly original at the time, to be able to tell a story in a very short period of time, to not have too much money, therefore you couldn't get too expansive about what you were doing, and therefore the whole art of shooting tight and close-up, which became the stock in trade really of a lot of television drama. He was the first person to do that.
I made one once which took me just 2 days to do. I think it was a Roald Dahl story called Lamb to the Slaughter. A young wife, played by Barbara Bel Geddes, was preparing dinner. Her husband, who's the chief of police, comes home and tells her they're all washed up, there's another woman. And she, almost in a trauma, goes out to the garage and takes a leg of lamb, which is frozen, out of the deep freeze, and comes back, and she finds her husband rummaging through the desk drawer. And she said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm getting my things together." She said, "You're not going tonight." He said, "You try and stop me." She goes up behind him with the frozen leg of lamb and kills him. And finally you end with all the detectives and police sitting around the table, just having finished the leg of lamb, and one of them says, "Well, I don't know, for all we know, it may be under our very noses." And that's the end of the story. Of course, when you make that kind of TV film, the censor must step in, because there's a need for what is called the retribution clause. She cannot get away with it. So I come on in a supermarket at the end, wheeling the usual basket, and I stop and I say, "You know, she married a second time, but the second time she forgot to turn on the deep freeze."
I've always liked Hitchcock's comment, "I have brought murder back into the home where it belongs." And I think this dry sense of humour went along with his appearance as well in some ways, which was quite comical, this portly English gentleman who could be easily caricatured, but also, of course, very valuably, was instantly recognisable.
It endeared him to people. That wonderful fat profile, you know, the caricature almost, was charming in its own way, the lovable fat man. I think it was terribly clever of him to do that, and it made the Hitchcock name a brand.
It was the very early days of merchandising, so you didn't just have Alfred Hitchcock Presents, but, you know, everywhere you went was like there was a comic book of Alfred Hitchcock crime stories or books and things. The Hitchcock brand.
What Alan Parker and Hitchcock have in common is, of course, the fact that they were both Londoners, and working-class Londoners, come to that. Both a bit chippy. They were both in advertising, and, of course, they both went off to Hollywood, embraced Hollywood, and were embraced by Hollywood.
My own experience in advertising and Hitchcock's experience in advertising were very different. I was a writer in advertising in what was then a very sophisticated advertising world. He started out in film studios doing titles, you know, where he would do a little drawing or something to go with the title, to be able to boil down something to its essence, to one picture and one line, which is what he was doing with regards to his captions, isn't a million miles away from actually writing an ad. And I think in that regard there's probably some similarity.
I usually wear a blue suit, a white shirt, black socks, no jewellery of any kind, no ornamentation, not even a wristwatch. I think it relates to one's tidiness of mind. I have a very tidy mind.
His appearance epitomised his sense of order and self-discipline. He always said that his self-discipline came from his early schooling in this Jesuit school where he was brought up. And he sort of carried this into his filmmaking, where he was extremely disciplined. He would always come to the set wearing a suit and tie. He would always have the same lunch, apparently. And I think actors felt reassured by this. Here was a man who seemed in control. At the same time, you can see how it wouldn't exactly encourage a sense of spontaneity or improvisation. The actors were mainly there to be part of Hitchcock's visual design.
What he liked in an actor was an actor who could do nothing very well, because that's exactly what he wanted them to do. So in a way, yeah, they were like props. Even Maria Saint summed it up the most, is that she would have done On the Waterfront with Kazan, who would have put his arm around her and taken her into the corner and given her some very serious intellectual advice on what she would be feeling and who the character was and how she was and where she should be at a certain point. Whereas when she worked with Hitchcock, it was do it faster, do it quieter, put your hand there, turn left, go over there, i.e. very physical kind of direction, very similar direction, for instance, to someone like David Lean.
He wouldn't have any truck with method acting and motivation. I mean, he said to one actor who asked him, "Why am I doing this?" He said, "Because you're getting paid." And Tippi Hedren in The Birds said, in the famous scene where she goes up to the attic and opens the door and suddenly the ravens attacked her, well, there's no real reason why she should do that in the film, except that it makes a wonderful scene.
They built a cage around the set, and for 5 days there were 4 prop men who hurled birds at me. We were all in the cage. This was so that the birds wouldn't be up in the rafters somewhere, you know. I was on the floor and the birds were tied to me. One of them decided, he was sitting on my shoulder, he decided to sit on my face and clawed my eye here a little bit too close, and it upset me to the point where I just got all of them off of me and sat down in the middle of the set and just cried.
And she said to him, "Tell me, why am I doing this?" And he said, "Because I've told you to." As far as Hitchcock was concerned, that was enough.
You once told me that actors were cattle to be shoved about. I wonder if you'd care to enlarge on that.
You mean you want to make them larger cattle than they are?
I wondered, had you ever been tempted to step outside the sort of thriller limitation and do something completely different?
Well, no, it's not for me. It's the public, you see. If I made, for example, a musical, the public would wonder, when will the moment come when one of the chorus girls will drop dead? And what from?
I don't know that anybody got to the bottom of who he was. I think that he was very skilled at giving the old public persona a workout. Nobody got really close to him. I think he was manipulative in his interviews that he did. So I don't know truthfully that one can find out from interviews that were filmed or from what is written too much about him. So it would have been great just to sat down and got the real truth. Talked about Islington and then talked about what it's like to be a film director.
That was Alan Parker. He was joined by Peter Bogdanovich, Barry Norman, Neil Sinyard and the unmistakable voice of Alfred Hitchcock. The producer was Kate Bland. It was a Just Radio production for BBC Radio 4.